Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Earlier this week, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution which calls on member states to stop testing of direct-ascent anti-satellite weapons. DAASATs, as they're called in short, became a hot topic after India's test in 2019, followed by Russia's test last year. India abstained from voting on the resolution earlier in October. To talk about the importance of this resolution and the merits and demerits of DAASAT test ban, I'm joined by Pranav Satyanath, my colleague at Takshashila, who has paid close attention to matters related to space security. Welcome to the show, Pranav.
Hi, Shri.
So, Pranav, why don't you begin by telling us what are the origins of this call for a DAASAT test ban and why has the issue gained salience in the recent times?
So, direct-ascent anti-satellites weapons are missiles that can shoot down a satellite, right? You fire them from Earth and it hits a satellite, or it hits close to a satellite, and it creates a lot of damage. DAASATs are not new. In fact, in the 1960s, the US built these weapons with a nuclear-tipped warhead, which meant that a small nuclear bomb would detonate in space and it would damage one satellite or a number of satellites. These weapons themselves are not new. And by the 1980s and 1990s, once these weapons had become old and they were not really of much use, there were calls for banning testing because people realized that blowing up satellites would create a lot of debris and that wouldn't generally be good. So discussions have been happening since the 1990s through informal circles, even in the United Nations itself. In 1984, the UN adopted this resolution called the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And one of the discussions was banning ground-based anti-satellite testing. In 2008, a few scholars again started writing about this. After China's test in 2007, they started calling for such bans, but nothing really happened. In 2019, India tested it, but India tested it at a very low altitude. So it created some debris. There are about 50 small pieces of debris still in very low Earth orbit that will probably fall down in the next couple of years. Then Russia in 2021 tested its anti-satellite weapon. It was a missile that was converted to an anti-satellite role, and this is a very, very high altitude test. The missile flew higher than the International Space Station. And it created a lot of debris, so much debris that the ISS actually had to carry out maneuvers to avoid debris collision. And the Americans quite got worried about it, and the international community in general got worried about it, and they were like, "Hey, let's try to ban anti-satellite testing." Then in April 2021, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris gave a speech to the U.S. Space Force in which she said that the U.S. will adopt a moratorium on direct-ascent anti-satellite, destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite testing. And this is a very specific commitment. She said that the US will not conduct destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite testing in the future. She did not say that the US will completely stop testing these kinds of missiles. She did not say that the US will not deploy these missiles. It was just a test ban of a certain type. And that's where the origins were, because it was also a strategic way. Because earlier in April, when it was announced, all of us who were watching space security issues very closely knew that in May, the open-ended working group on reducing space threats. This was a informal UN body that meets every few months, and we knew that the first meeting, would be held in May. And we all suspected that this was timed so that the issue would become of prominence in the discussions at the OEWG. And I've written extensively about this in a previous document that Aditya and I have discussed. And these are the origins of it. The US, for a very long time, wanted a test ban but did not find the right platform for it. And the open ended working group proved to be a sufficiently flexible platform where they could garner support. And soon after the Vice President Kamala Harris announced this moratorium, they started doing this back channel diplomacy and front channel diplomacy and lobbying, first with their allies and then with neutral countries, eventually getting about 10 countries to formally adopt this moratorium. And those are the origins of this rather creative and very specific moratorium.
Right. So next, I wanted to know from you, where exactly does India's interest lie in this regard, right? Because India has successfully conducted this testing a couple of years ago, and that was a milestone in our space security. Uh, and India has abstained from this resolution and has not necessarily opposed it. So, what do you make of India's position? Why do you think India abstained?
So India had already gained a position when it conducted a test, right? It made sure that it was not locked into any sort of tight position where it couldn't test. So in 2019, they had opened enough doors so that they had some sense of satisfaction that they had conducted a test and they were not pressured by the international community. Like what happened with our nuclear weapons. CTB, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, was adopted, and only after the treaty was adopted did India conduct its nuclear test in 1998. So India did not want to be in such that situation. But that being said, the tests of the India opposed the moratorium because of the very nature of how it's issued. So when the US announced the moratorium, they said that this is because they're concerned about debris, and anti-satellite testing creates a lot of debris. And in order to prevent space debris, they're issuing a moratorium on ASAT testing. And this was quite problematic for India because you are clubbing what is essentially a security issue. That is, your anti-satellite, your DA ASATs being a threat to satellites is a security issue. But you are calling for a ban under the pretext of debris creation. And because they were mixing security and safety, India found it a problem. And this was what India said during its explanation of vote when it abstained. It said that we should not club security issue with space sustainability issue, and therefore we're abstaining. And there is some merit to this because for space sustainability, the UN has a separate track, and it adopted something called as long-term sustainability guidelines in 2018. And the long-term sustainability guidelines offers several set of measures for states to follow, for countries to follow, so that there's no confusion about what is harmful and what is not harmful. And it to some extent brings clarity in international law. But ASAT testing is something a security issue because it does not prevent technology. You can still test these missiles or anti-satellite weapons without hitting a satellite, right? So the US and China do this quite often, where they choose an empty space in low Earth orbit and they simulate a virtual target and they launch a missile towards it. And the US did this with for its ballistic missile defenses. So BMDs and ASATs share similar technology, and we've spoken extensively about this in other episodes. And that's the reason. And India has opposed this because it mixes two distinct issues, even though they're intimately connected. India thinks that the US moratorium does not sufficiently address the technology development side of space weapons.
Right. So let's take a short break now, and we'll come back with more discussion on ASATs. Welcome back to All Things Policy. We're in conversation with Pranav about the UN resolution calling on member states to stop the use of ASAT weapons, stop the testing of ASAT weapons in space. So, Pranav, let's look at the ban itself, right? So, I understand that this is a US sponsored resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, and most nations have supported it and have agreed to call for a moratorium on the ASAT testing. How effective do you think this US sponsored call for a ban is going to be? And do you think it is going to be respected by other member states, or is there going to be more contestation on it?
Yeah, I had to clarify that the US first called for such a moratorium in 2021 April, 2022 April this year, and then it eventually sponsored a resolution with some of its friendly countries to make it a larger issue. So it wasn't a UN call out of the blue, and like I said, the ban is very specific. It is not a treaty. It is not agreed by all members. In fact, only 10 countries have formally adopted it. And most of these countries don't have direct ascent anti satellite capability. To some extent, they have missiles that can hit satellites, but it's not like a built to order technology, right? It can be some of the missiles can be adopted to perform anti satellite roles, particularly with South Korea and Japan. What the problem, as I see it as well, is that it does not control the technology in itself. It gives the US, China, Russia, and other countries, even India, a free rein to continue testing missiles that can hit satellites without actually hitting satellites. You can say you are doing a ballistic missile defense test, a BMD test, or you can say you're doing a missile test, and you can launch these missiles into high altitudes without hitting any targets. And that's also one of the drawbacks of this treaty, one of the drawbacks of this moratorium. It's very limited. But the argument by the proponents goes that if all countries agree to stop testing, then a country that suddenly starts testing will feel a sense of will feel that it's violating a norm, international norm. So when you create an international norm, states are incentivized to test because they don't want to be the odd one out, carrying out behavior that is a taboo. We haven't reached that stage yet. Only 10 countries have formally adopted this, and only 4 countries have actually ever tested anti-satellite weapons: Russia, China, US, and India. So it doesn't really have that much of an effect. Although no country would want to test ASATs as well, right? You would need one successful test to prove that your weapon works. And China did this. In 2007, they had only one destructive test and they stopped testing. And after China conducted one destructive test, all its subsequent tests till 2014 were simulating targets in space. They were not real targets. The US demonstrated that it was capable in 2008 after it said that it was hitting a satellite for safety reasons. And the US has subsequently not done such a test. The US has carried out very, very low altitude missile defense tests. Similarly, Russia, in fact, conducted several tests, first by simulating targets, and only once it actually hit a real target. I believe India also does the same. India has a separate missile defense program where we continue to test our Prithvi air defense system and our high altitude missile defenses. And so essentially, countries only have to test once. I don't think Japan, South Korea will actually conduct these tests because they don't want to create a safety hazard for other countries. So in a way, the moratorium is good. It doesn't harm India. It doesn't harm any other country because we won't be testing more weapons anyway. But it's also it doesn't do much. It will allow continue to deploy these weapons. It will allow continue to make these weapons better without actually hitting satellites. And I'm being repetitive here, but it should be stressed that this test ban does not achieve much except try to set international norms. And that's the basic problem here.
So, Pranav, since you were mentioning that this resolution suffers from certain inherent weaknesses, what do you think would be an optimal sort of resolution? How do you think we can strengthen this resolution which we have today?
So, my idea of strengthening a resolution is quite simple. You issue this ban and you try to make it a treaty, and a treaty that has some form of verification. How do you verify that a country is not hitting another satellite? We use something called space situational awareness. These are mostly ground based or electro optical radars that look at space objects and track space objects by either emitting radio frequencies or lasers, and they receive it back and they know where the object roughly is. So when a country conducts an anti-satellite test, naturally a whole lot of debris is created. And if you're able to verify this with ground-based radars, then what you could probably do is you could stop collaborating with that country. You could stop You could stop commercial collaboration. And this has happened with Russia, for example. After Russia invaded Ukraine, no private satellite operator wants to launch its satellites on Russian rockets. So previously, Russia used its Soyuz rocket to launch commercial payloads, including OneWeb. So OneWeb is a company that wants to launch a large internet constellation. And once and once OneWeb one withdrew their commitment to launch on a Soyuz rocket. Many months later, they launched from India. That is, they launched 36 satellites from India. So you could have those disincentives. So if you test, companies could stop collaborating with you. Countries could stop collaborating with you. So such a treaty would definitely help, but that in itself would not control the weapon technology. And I think it's okay to not control the weapon technology, because the very nature of the weapon technology is that you can have an anti-satellite weapon either on a ballistic missile or a missile defense system, and these systems can be easily modified to hit a satellite. So if you want to ban these technologies themselves, you would have to ban an entire class of missiles and missile defenses. That is impossible, especially given that China and India do not want any sort of intrusion this way. So having a verification measure in itself would create some form of a norm. And probably this would be a stretch, but one could probably adopt altitude guidelines. So you could say no country can test missiles or missile defenses beyond 200 kilometers above Earth's surface. And this could in some way limit to the degree to which you can launch your rockets. But it's very difficult to enforce, because you have North Korea, which launches its missiles at very, very high altitudes, and it tests its ranges. So you have those technology limits, but ASAT test guidelines, altitude guidelines could be pushed. And this would in some way control the technology, but it wouldn't really have definitive measures. And these are some ways to go forward if we want a legitimate security concern being addressed.
Sure. So, Pranav, I have one last question for you, which is, would you like to comment on the practical feasibility of the solution you propose, which is having a treaty with a verification mechanism, especially given the current geopolitical situation today?
Yeah, in the current geopolitical situation, it's nearly impossible, given that Russia and China have their own separate track for reducing space threats. Every year, they sponsor a resolution on confidence building measures and transparency, where they essentially say that countries should not place weapons in space. No first placement of weapons. They don't define a space weapon correctly. It's very vague. And essentially, it is designed to call on the Americans to stop ballistic missile defense testing or ballistic missile defense deployment. So they will pursue their own track, and they will likely never agree to a US sponsored resolution. But someday in the future, let's say 3, 4, 5 years, we could come to an agreement where country can share data. Currently, there is no international system for space situational awareness. But someday in the future, you could have a monitoring center, a data exchange center, where countries independently submit SSA data, and this data is set to a certain standard where there is no conflict. And you could practically implement it by having certain standards of measurement. But we are very, very far away from that. My idea is that unless countries start disclosing some of their space activities, then it's quite impossible to come to any sort of an agreement. It can be practically done. It would be a little more expensive, but it can be done. But the question is the political conditions that determine the positions. But it is feasible. If we're talking purely about feasibility, it is definitely feasible. We can have a verification mechanism.
Thanks a lot, Pranav, for this discussion today. And we hope to hear more from you on space security in the forthcoming episodes. Thanks once again for joining.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com. or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.